Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicolas. So before talking about science fiction, I want to show a picture of a weird German guy. And I always like to start my presentation about the future with all Europeans, like this guy. So two stories. First story, this guy called Eugen Langen was one of the inventor at the beginning of the 19th century of the monorail. I don't know how familiar you are with monorail and their presence in science fiction, but it's one of the most important type of vehicle you can find in science fiction novel or science fiction movies. And Eugen Langen designed that object at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and it's built in Wuppertal in Germany. It's actually still active today, and it's a fantastic experience to travel with that kind of thing. But interestingly, if you look at how this common artifact from science fiction have traveled over time, if I can say that, you can find differences based on the project that we had in Wuppertal. And you can find projects like the monorail in Las Vegas, or the one in airports like at London Heathrow, for instance. So it's a different story. It's not exactly the same type of vehicle. It's not the same type of science fiction where a lot of people in cities will be moved around by this object. It's only a specific context, like the very hot climate of Nevada in Las Vegas here, or the busy airport in London. And if you look at other examples of how monorail have hit the ground, so to say, it's not very nice. That's the monorail in Sevilla, in Spain, a few years after the World Expo in 1992. So now the monorail, those traces of the future from Sevilla has been transferred somewhere else. I think it's going to be in Zaragoza. But there was a point in time in which those objects from the future literally hit the ground. They were not as used as they were. And there are only examples like Wuppertal or those projects that I've shown in Las Vegas or London Heathrow where the monorail is still active. And when you see things like The Simpsons, when I work on popular culture in the future, it's always good to look at things like The Simpsons because there's a tendency to, from the authors of The Simpsons to mock or to criticize this representation of the future in a very interesting way. And you have this episode in which a guy comes to Springfield and tell them that, oh, if you want to be the leading city in America, if you want to be creative, you need to have a monorail. And of course, Homer Simpson is the driver of the monorail, and it's a big failure. And it's also one of those examples of how an object from science fiction is not necessarily as good as it was in the science fiction movies. And interestingly, if you look at projects about the future of cities, and that's Paris, Le Grand Paris, the future of Paris, you can find examples of how the monorail returned to the imaginary representation of architects and designers as if it was the best solution for the future of a city like Paris. And for me, this is this kind of recurring presence of certain artifacts like the monorail coming from science fiction and always present in a project about the future. That's a sort of imagination breakdown from the part of designers, engineers, and people interested in developing the future. So that's the first story. Second story, which is an excerpt from a movie, I've put the reference here, that has been shot in Melanesia some time ago. And it's a collaboration between a movie director and anthropologist who were interested in how people in this country were fascinated by those objects, like the aircraft, for instance. And they were so fascinated by those objects that they tried to rebuild the flying aircraft, like that one. And the anthropologists call this a cargo cult, a cult for those cargoes that in the 18th century or 17th century, the cargoes were the boats coming to Melanesia. And the people there wanted to recreate those objects. And they did the same with those aircraft. But of course, they never flied. So there is this notion of cargo cult when you see a certain thing and you want to, recreate it in a way that would be meaningful for you. And the way I see the object from science fiction is very similar to this kind of cargo cult. If you look at those artifacts that we can find in science fiction, like robots, the humanoid robots, the anthropomorphic robots, it's interesting to see how a lot of people in research lab, in R&D centers or in universities are pursuing that dream of recreating, that's the MIT Media Lab. They're trying to recreate or to mimic this object that they dreamed about in science fiction. Another example is the notion of virtual assistant. Who remember that guy? So if you look at some papers about virtual assistants, research papers about virtual assistants like Clippy from Microsoft, those research papers explicitly mention that they want to recreate this kind of virtual robots or virtual assistant that they saw in science fiction book or science fiction movie. And series, of course, very close to that. If you look at also the Jetsons or all those science fiction projects or movies and books from the 50s, the notion of automation and how automation might be good for people, like having your robot at home doing things on your behalf, or your fridge might be connected to some sort of high-end technology that would do something for you. That leads explicitly to the smart fridge or the internet fridge. I don't know who of you has already experienced an internet fridge, but it's this idea that your fridge can detect what's inside and would automatically reorder things that have been missing in the fridge. And if you look at the studies, the user studies about how people use that kind of stuff, you definitely find that they don't use that kind of stuff, and there are big problems related to that. And that's also, for me, this sort of imagination breakdown of an idea that was present in science fiction and that was transferred into the present, and that did not really work. And that leads to this kind of situation. There are plenty of books like this from people who grew up like us in an era where science fiction was glorified with all those objects like jetpacks, robots, home automation, flying cars. And those objects are not really present. Of course, they've been invented, they've been created by engineers and designers. There are jetpacks, there are flying cars, but for some reasons, we're not using them. And some of the reasons are because of the regulation. It's really hard to regulate the air environment when you have flying cars. It's much more difficult than actual cars. But there are plenty of other reasons for this. And I won't focus on the reasons about that. I will only show another lament from Peter Thiel, this venture capitalist, who was kind of sad that we did not invent, or we didn't use flying car, but we only glorifying things like Twitter. And my point here is not necessarily about looking the reasons why we don't use flying cars and why we prefer using things like Twitter. It's another aspect that I'm interested in. It's how science fiction, which used to be some sort of representation of the future with a certain allure or with a certain, I would say, a certain standard of how the future could be, somehow lost its status in being a source of inspiration for technology. And the next question, of course, is who's going to be, who's trying to push the boundaries and recreate some sort of imaginary representation of the future. And being interested in design, in interaction design and design related with digital technology, I think that designers today are, well, the most interesting, and of course new media artists as well, they are the most interesting characters in trying to show alternative visions of the future to make us dream about the future or to scare us about how the future could be. So I'm going to spend some time with a few examples that I like about that. First example, and it's maybe more about a scary representation of the future. It's this artist collective called Conductor, who created this series of videos about the electromagnetic waves that surrounds us in the environment. And with their graphic design skills, they created this very weird representation of how all around us we have all those weird waves that are present and that we do not necessarily see because our eyes are not necessarily trained, or we don't have the right physiological structure to see that. And I encourage you to look at their movie. It's quite scary when you see all those bubbles and waves around us. To me, that's very inspiring as a way to understand the world we live in and how the world in the future might evolve. Second example about the future and the future of robots by a design collective called Auger Loiseau from the UK. Their starting point was that robots that we have in science fiction, or the robots that I showed you at the beginning of the presentations, are not necessarily the most relevant representation of how they could be present in our everyday life. They were more interested in how objects around us could be turned into robots with a certain sentient presence, a certain way to detect what's happening in the environment and act on top of that. And they created this series of objects, like this very weird table that can actually, the table is actually fed by animals like mouses that can go into that kind of trap based on the crumbles and the food debris inside the table. And the table itself is powered by the animal that are digested by the object itself. And I find this quite weird and quite scary, or perhaps a bit useless. But five months after observing that project, I ran across that nice website, by the way. I came across that project from one of the subcontractors of the American Army, a company called Robotic Technology Incorporation, which has this project funded by DARPA in the US of a robot that can go on the field and eat food, vegetables, insects, and regenerate its fuel cell power based on the very same project as the design collective that I presented before. And for me, that's why looking at how designers and artists are creating those weird things that might seem coming from a science fiction movie is actually a good way to find some trends or some representation of how the future could be. Other example that I find interesting is this design collective in London called Superflux, which collaborated with optogeneticians. Those are researchers interested in the genetics of our eyes and the way we look at things. And they were interested in envisioning a representation of the future in which blind people could see things based on optogenetics. So they created this movie, you can find that movie on their website, in which they envision what that would be, how the process would be for the blind people. And it's literally a bit scary, but interesting at the same time. The idea is to inject in people's eyes a bacteria that would transform the protein in the eyes, and then make people, using those kind of glasses, see things like this. So the idea is to make those blind people things with different color, and the color would appear because of the bacteria that would affect the protein in the eyes. And that may look weird as well, but it's because designers work with scientists to create this kind of weird representation of the future that it show an alternative vision to what already exists in terms of solutions for blind people. And two last examples from the Near Future Laboratory, my own practice. First project in which we were interested in the near future of movement or gestures we do with digital technologies. So in this project that I did in collaboration with the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, in California, we started by observing the kind of gestures we all do with technology today. It's like laptops, cell phones, etc. So you have examples here. This is me in the toilets waving because the light went off, because the sensor detected no activity in the toilets. I'm pretty sure you already experienced that. This is a Korean girl watching a movie on her bed. This is the human periscope, the way people take pictures of things. It's even more amusing with an iPad, like I saw you doing like this, the human periscope with an iPad. This is the baboon face when you try to protect your face from, or your phone conversation from the others. The guy raising his finger here is a Korean grandfather trying to get a better signal on his cell phone, and he thinks that doing this might help. So there was a starting point. We were interested in documenting what we do with digital technology and then project ourselves in the future. What would be the equivalent to this in the future? So we did a short movie. I won't show the whole movie, but a movie with the equivalent of those gestures in the near future. So this is a couple of people recharging their augmented glasses or their cell phones by making this kind of movements. It's something you can already do with their patents to recharge your digital devices making physical movements. And we were interested in what would be the equivalent of, what would be the way we will do that in the physical space and the kind of norms that would appear. So we might do this kind of thing in the future. We might bang or touch our face when using brain-computer interfaces, because that's a way to focus. And if you look at how people use brain-computer interfaces today, those interfaces that detect your mental activity to control a video game or an application on screen, you can see people doing things like that already, moving their head because they do not necessarily know how to use it, or touching their face because that's a way for them to focus. So we just push that a little bit and include that in the movie. And last example, and is one of the new projects we are working on, is this paperback, this trade paperback newsletter that we do for people in the business of science fiction producers or writers, or people writing scenarios or for anime movies or films. That is about the new kind of technologies that could play a role in science fiction. So it's basically a list of technology and why they could be interesting in a science fiction movie or a movie about the future, what kind of problem they may cause. And we try to discuss that in conjunction with the object that we already have nowadays and the type of behavior we already have as a source of inspiration to make science fiction a bit different and a bit more, a bit more alternative than all those monorails, robots, and things that we already saw till now. And that's it. Thank you.
Now, are we having any questions? I'm going to bring the mic to the person who would like to ask something. Just wave your hand. Yeah.
Hello. I have it's a general question, not only for you. It's I read. I don't know if you know this article in the Time about the future, the next 15 years. And what I noticed, I'm a science fiction writer, so I'm a little bit into this. And what I noticed is that people who think about the future, they think too much technology, not enough how will people behave. Like, what I'm trying to think a little bit out of the box and see what's not working today. Like, you take 50% divorce, technology might not help us to solve that problem. So thinking in other direction, and I think one big way is to think about how to handle our emotions, various kinds. So yeah, that's just one thing, and how we interact. And yeah.
There's this quote by Frederick Pohl, who's a science fiction writer well, sorry. A quote from Frederick Pohl, a science fiction writer from the 50s, and he said, science fiction is not about predicting the automobiles, but it's predicting the traffic jam. And that's exactly what you say. It's less about technology and more the implications, the problems about technology or other kind of social change, as you mentioned. What's interesting when it comes to, I mean, I'm interested in design, and I also teach at the design school in Geneva, HEAD. What I'm interested in discussing in my class with the students is how observing how people behave might be a good way to represent how things might change in the future, because there are certain constant design patterns in ways we behave, and there are changes. Could be technological changes, it could be social changes, and by looking at this whole ecosystem of changes, it's a way to just to brainstorm. It's not science, it's more related to art, to think about the possibilities, and thinking about them is a good way to plan for problems or opportunities for changing things as well.
Anyone else? Any more questions?
Thanks, Nicolas. What are, to your mind, the big innovations we will experience this coming year, either in technology or other fields?
Well, there are two kinds of innovation. The one which are we can see them, always hear about them in the press, because they seem like very important, like robots, for instance, or big data. I'm much more interested in what's happening at a lower level, and of course we hear about it, but algorithm and the way algorithms and computer programs are changing every single aspect of our everyday life. That's more and more important. For someone coming from 100 years ago, you would get in a car. The car itself would not be so different, but there would be this very weird noise because you did not fasten your seatbelt. There would be on the radio this kind of weird music with auto-tune. You will receive messages on this device that can show you a map. So all the power of information technology, which is not necessarily as visible as like a monorail or a huge orbital station, that's one of the driving forces, I think. But then if you ask me about more like weirder things, brain interfaces, that's one thing that we will hear a lot, because there are a lot of progress about how we can detect things in our mental activity. That's of course super complicated in terms of how to turn that into something meaningful, but that's super exciting. And the fact that we can track it without necessarily going into the brain is interesting, but the fact that we can put sensors in the brain or in our body, that's also a bit scary and a bit interesting at the same time, I would say.
Thanks. Who are the clients of the near future lab, and how do they use the results of your work?
Yeah. So of course that's the, I would say, the good side, or the work that is the coolest type of work. We do of course product testing and prototyping with data that is a bit more traditional. But for this kind of project, it's mostly big companies interested in the future of the product. So they either hire us to criticize or to comment on their project, to challenge their hypothesis, or to challenge the path they've chosen. Or they could be interested in communicating about the stuff they do, not necessarily externally, but internally in their company, about how their object might be used by people, because they might have a prototype that is only a prototype on the table that is not necessarily thought as something that could be inserted into people's life. So that's the sort of things they are interested in when they contact us. Another angle is when they are looking for like the next 3 to 5 years and what kind of direction they could take in terms of research and product development. We do sort of workshops with them, and we use certain techniques similar to this, like showing them some sort of example of science fiction, how science fiction, objects from science fiction circulated from the fiction to reality, like the table you can find in Tron or Minority Report interfaces, and also showing them the failures, what did not necessarily work, and contrast that with their experience, with their kind of product, and how there's a possibility to challenge their preconceptions or their hypotheses in their product based on that kind of material. Not necessarily easy to sell, but possible anyway.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Nova, for the talk. I was just wondering, you didn't talk a lot about space, outer space, as well, you know that space played a very important role in the past in our conceptions about the future. Now with the cancellation, especially of many US missions, what do you think will be the history of the future of space travel and exploration? Thank you.
Just one mic today.
So it's the time lapse coming from the sky. Well, one of the reasons I didn't talk about that is that first, I'm not an expert in that field, so I'm not that knowledgeable about it. And second is exactly the same reasons you mentioned. It's because a lot of projects have been canceled. That said, and related with the notion of androids and robots, it's interesting to see how they act as a sort of proxy for visiting different planets or for having sensors in in the sky or somewhere else in space about that. But that's one thing. The other thing that I find interesting is how this kind of golden era of visiting space as creating a sort of a sense of nostalgia for people who grew up with this kind of experiments, and as if we did it, but like the Concorde, like other kind of technologies, we've put that on the side, and we do not necessarily use them anymore for different reasons. It can be expensive, it can be very, very difficult, but I'm pretty sure at some point some people will resume that kind of exploration. It's not necessarily us, the Western world, doing that, but I guess it's different phases. But on the other hand, the problems are so complicated that that's really hard to think about that. So I don't know if you saw you remember this project called Biosphere in the US, where they put people in this huge dome as an experiment to see how people would behave 6 months living together without any contact with the rest of the world. And it was a mess. I mean, some people were fighting each other. I think they were divorced, and it was really dramatic. So those are also problems that we need to consider, and that's why I'm interested in science fiction as a way to take that into account, and how then designers can take that into account and create something that can be based on that kind of knowledge. But space is so complicated that my impression is that we went into space, now we're going very, very, very deep into the body as a sort of other kind of challenge that can be explored by technology and other sort of engineering sciences.
Thank you, Nicolas, for the interesting talk. There is one technology you're certainly aware of, which is today present and is talked about, and was anticipated in the science fiction, which is 3D printing. You are a designer in part, and you certainly know about that. I wanted to know whether you think that this is something that is there to stay, is there to have a big impact in the society, or is something that will end up like the Monorail Sevilla?
I don't know everything in science fiction, but I think there's a 3D printer in Tintin, and one of the, not the graphic novels, but in the animated movie, I don't remember the name, but you can see the Professor Tournesol with a 3D printer. So I find that fascinating because it was from 50 years ago. Now, that said, and of course I'm not like I can only have an educated guess about 3D printing, but that's here to stay. That's very important. It might be a bit different from all those general discourses about Fab Labs and the fact that with do-it-yourself technology we will all create our own objects. That might be very difficult because it's hard to create a 3D model of something. If you look at how people use Google SketchUp or Second Life, it's really hard for people to create this. And when I say people, myself, I count myself as one of the person who had troubles creating a 3D model. But at the same time, you can download stuff from the internet, platforms like Thingiverse and others like this. So there could be possibilities. And you can envision a potential future in which there could be objects, not necessarily at home, but in a shop where people can buy things and pièces détachées, objects that you can reuse for your own artifacts. Or you can also have things at home that can print very simple and basic artifacts to repair something that you have. And that's, I mean, I would say that it's quite likely, but I'm not sure about people's skills to create the object themselves as opposed to finding them in a platform. And that's only my guess.
Good morning. To go back to where you said that we're going deeper into the body, how much of the innovation is actually held back by ethics?
Well, one thing that I should have said is that it's not because I mentioned all those things that I'm in favor of those things. And when it comes to the body, the ethical problems are much more important than I mean, a monorail for a city, although there can be environmental problems. But with the way we augment our body, and I say we augment our body because that's already done. I mean, pacemakers, ear implants, and things like that have been invented in the last 15 years. So we're already doing it. And what's interesting is the shift between using this technology to cure people, the people who have certain disabilities, to augment people into being much more good at certain things. Like if you remember Oscar Pistorius with his legs and the kind of results his legs led him to have. So that's one thing that I find interesting, is this shift between curing to augmenting that is quite problematic in terms of how our society works and what kind of problems and inequalities you might create based on money issues, ethical issues, and things like that. And that's why, I mean, for all those problems, the ethical problems should be considered. And I don't have necessarily the solution for this. But one of them is, and related with science fiction, is the fact that people can think about the consequences of what they design. That's very important. And that's why the role played by science fiction writers or those designers creating those weird things that I've shown, which are not necessarily in favor of doing this. It's a way to have this discussion about it. The guy who designed this table that can be fed by a mouse, they also designed a tooth with a small hole inside the tooth. And they hated that idea, but they were interested in having the conversation about what it means to have a tooth that can help you to make phone calls. And something that is much more interesting than this project that they've done is the 300s of emails they received from people who were really enthusiastic about it, or others who found that it was a really, really bad idea. And this kind of discussion should be made public as a way to discuss the potential problems or the potential opportunities that technology can lead to in our society. And that's why, I mean, surfacing the problems and not focusing only on the object is important. Science fiction or those design fiction should not be just a catalog of technological possibilities, but a way to discuss the opportunities and problems that we have in our society.
I think we're gonna stop here. Thank you very much for your presentation, Nico. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming this morning. We would like to welcome you and invite you to participate at our challenge that we prepared today. I hope you have some objects with you from the future. If not, you are, of course, welcome to create some here around with paper, flyers, whatever you want. Josh is waiting for you. Otherwise, we see you next time. Thank you very much, everybody.